Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya. Good morning, Adefemi. Well, I won't say you are enjoying New York. I mean, you are London born, London raised, so being in New York is no big deal to you. But to some people, it's a serious big deal. Anyway, good morning from here in Nigeria.
Oh, Dr. Rubin, it's definitely a big deal to me. It's definitely a big deal to me. Being able to be at the United Nations General Assembly, being able to see different heads of states, different presidents, different international figures. As a stickler for international news, I'm having a great time. So definitely it is a big deal for me. A very good morning to you, Dr. Rubin, and to you, Vimbai, and to you, Rafai. Always a pleasure to hear your voices very, very early in the morning. And boy, it is early in the morning this morning. But let me tell you about how the first day of high-level meetings took place here at the 79th edition of the United Nations. So let's start now with one of the biggest stories dominating international news is what we're seeing in the Middle East. The situation continues to escalate. One of our latest stories on our global brief, we'll probably take it now actually, looks at the fact that overnight Israel have dropped more airstrikes on targets in Lebanon, killing more than 400 people, which is single most the deadliest day in the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel up until this point. Again, another sign that they are inching ever closer to all-out war. Unfortunately, this is happening against the backdrop, as you said, Dr. Rubin, yesterday, against the backdrop of the United Nations, of many countries coming together. The general consensus with these countries and their leadership is to avoid war and conflict at all costs. So naturally, seeing these tensions continue to escalate despite UNGA being ongoing is just a clear picture about the severity of the situation that we are seeing in the Middle East. But staying with UNGA itself, in terms of the events that we've been able to participate, we had a very, very full diary yesterday. As you can imagine, it's going to continue to be the case. We did start the day looking at clean energy alternatives. Dr. Akinwumi Adesina did speak to my colleague Adesua Giwa Osagie, along with other leaders. The World Bank president too talked about how they are pushing for cleaner alternatives, but definitely electricity connectivity on the African continent as soon as possible. This will bring those updates to you later on today, but that was just one of the ways we started off our day. Moving on to Nigeria specifically though, the Vice President, Kashim Shettima, is in the United States. He is here in New York. We did see him yesterday. There was a somewhat closed door meeting held and led by the Vice President yesterday at a hotel in New York City, and it did have a lot of Nigerian ministers participating in that. Because it was closed door, they didn't come out and talk to us directly, specifically about what they were discussing within the confines of that meeting. But I do have some updates to share with you. We already knew that Vice President Kashim Shettima would be standing in for President Tinubu at the general debate on Wednesday evening, my apologies, and that continues to be the case. There was some confusion about whether or not the Vice President would deliver his own speech, or one that he may have written or prepared under his own purview. But reports are suggesting that he will deliver the speech that President Tinubu was supposed to deliver, that there will be no wavering or no difference between what the president was initially supposed to say and what the vice president is going to say when he takes the stage at the general debate. He will also be participating in other side conversations that were earmarked for President Tinubu. Again, there was some conversation and confusion about whether or not he would be the person who would be discussing and participating in these meetings, being that he is not the head of state. But we have heard that he will be participating in those conversations. And then lastly, another update is that while we were talking about Nigeria having a very, very late slot time, there is some chance that that time slot may change. No confirmations that yet, but as I said, in terms of the meetings that were held yesterday, these are the updates that we've been able to find from there. Again, on the sidelines of that meeting, we were able to speak and discuss with Nigerian ministers and talk to them about what they specifically, within the purview of their own ministries, are looking forward to during UNGA. Let's take a listen to what they had to say.
If I didn't have the support of Mr. President, who born you? I would have been sacked by now. That's what normally presidents do. But I've been taking giant steps, challenging issues that are not right to me concerning my job, and nothing has happened to me. So I came here actually for change of plans. I am going to fight it until I achieve it. As I speak to you, I've done it with UNICEF. UN Women is coming. I will make it so difficult for anyone to work in our country with the kind of way they've been working before now. Things must have to change. The narratives must change. So I came here just specifically on this because I was here last year. I went home with nothing. Most countries that come here, they go home with nothing as far as I'm concerned. If anybody has achieved anything, they should let me know. So we have to start achieving something. How do we start achieving something? By changing the action plan so that the former action plan they were using, which was fetching us nothing, will be changed to focus on who we are and what we can benefit from, what can impact on our people, and change the narratives for them so that the poor will start breathing, which is mainly the president's renewed hope agenda.
You know, at the moment, Nigeria is really having a moment whereby the whole world is so interested in what we have to say, our expression, because of our creatives, because of the fantastic things that the talented young Nigerians have done organically without government. So it's government's chance now to come in to see how we can join hands with members of the industry to leverage on that and to see how we can do a sort of repositioning of Nigeria.
Well, moving on from what we saw at the sideline Nigerian ministers meeting, if we look at UNGA itself and the events that took place yesterday, there was, of course, the goalkeepers event, which is a huge event naturally every year at UNGA. And what we were able to see at the participation of that event was a special focus on hunger, on food, and of quality nutrition around the world. So you did have the Gates Foundation talk a lot about food and how they can consider options and alternatives to making sure that people have access to clean food, have access to nutritionist food, but also looking at the fact that this is happening against the backdrop of climate sensitivities. So it was very interesting to see how food security and the climate was able to intersect in this way. Moving away from goalkeepers event specifically, we do know that Afrexim Bank also hosted an event yesterday, the first of a few events that they will continue to host over the course of the week. What Afrexim Bank did look at was launching their Global Africa Gateway, a platform that they say seeks to connect Africans on the continent with people in the diaspora. And it was quite a great and creative event, lots of different people participating in there. Of course, we saw the likes of Afrexim President Professor Benedict Orama taken to the stage, a whole host of Nigerian ministers there, Alhaji Aliko Dangote also in the crowd, also taken to the stage, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala also participating at that event while they unveiled a plaque and talked about their plans for Africa, what Africa needs to do to continue to harness its own talent in the international space, and that took place at the Africa Center in Harlem. So another very creative and interesting event taking place at UNGA, and there will be many more continuing. Again, I did touch on this earlier, but I do want to go in and discuss some other stories in our world brief. Definitely this airstrike by Israel on people in Lebanon, which killed 492 people. As I said, that is the single most deadliest attack that has been perpetuated by Israel in this conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And again, this is happening against the backdrop of the United Nations. Definitely many world leaders do not want to see the Middle East continue to edge closer to war, but this is the situation that we're seeing. It will be interesting to see whether or not at UNGA or at the Security Council towards the end of this month will deliver some thought of respite when it comes to easing tensions here and of course around the world, but especially in the Middle East. And then lastly, moving on to the African continent, a very interesting story coming out of two very significant African countries. Egypt has delivered its second shipment of weapons to Somalia. This is significant because Somalia is using these weapons and planning to use these weapons against or during its conflict with Ethiopia. Now, again, naturally, geographically, Somalia and Ethiopia, they're both in the East African region, they're both in the Horn of Africa, and traditionally have been somewhat allies. However, Somalia does seem to be pretty perturbed by the fact that Ethiopia has signed a treaty with Somaliland, in effect, acknowledging its independence from Somalia. Somalia, of course, does consider Somaliland to be a part of its sovereign land, but Somaliland, which has its own flag, the people of Somaliland do want to be separate from Somalia in general, and as a result are trying to broker different type of deals with different countries, including Ethiopia. We're seeing that create some sort of tension between Somalia and Ethiopia. And then if you would ask yourself why it is that Egypt is involving itself in this type of conflict, well, it boils down to water. Egypt and Ethiopia have been at loggerheads for years over the construction of a huge dam in Ethiopia, which will use waters from the Nile to fill up and to focus on the dam being built in Ethiopia. That's definitely going to build some form of pressure on the supply of water through the Nile, which of course runs through many different countries, not just Egypt. But again, just snapping back about, again, the international world order, about how for years many international journalists, about how many political scientists have predicted that the future editions of any type of world war would be fought over water. And what we're seeing with the Nile, with Egypt, with different countries, but especially Egypt and Ethiopia, how they're edging closer and closer to conflict over the Nile and the access to the water, is another example of, again, conflict being on the agenda, despite the fact that the world says it wants to move away from war and closer to peace.
I mean, Femi, very apt, makes a scene for an apocalyptic future movie or novel of any proportion. But we saw it was going to happen before, because most of these nations pretty much depend on the Nile. I think rather, from parts of East Africa down, up to North Africa, the Nile cuts across all. And we also know the role water has played in international conflict. If you remember the Suez Canal conflict, Britain and the leader of Egypt then, Gamal Abdel Nasser. But as regards this, as regards this, you have Somaliland that broke away from Somalia. They have their capital in a place called Hargeisa, which was as regards to fighting. And this goes back also to the Siabari days, in Somalia, all this while. If you remember the story, Siabari was finally brought to Nigeria, to be able to bring about some peace in Somalia before he passed in this country. I think he passed in Lagos back in the 90s. And this has been on for a while. Somaliland is about the place in only that region where you've got some level of peace. They've been trying to break away for some while. They've got some level of stability and all of that. And this time around, you can see the coalition, trying to urge on Somaliland. And Somalia definitely is not happy with that, because they want to definitely bring Somaliland and Hargeisa back into their folds. And Egypt, in the middle of this, supplying weapons. What is going to cause that imbalance across the African continent. And we don't want to set up more war fronts, because we equally have areas that we say have war fronts. We have war fronts in Sudan as in some other parts on the African continent. And this is where you expect the African Union to be able to step in and be able to bring some level of leadership. But if they will do it, only time will tell. On the sidelines of what is happening in UNGA, the gatekeepers events, the goalkeepers event, which is very apt, that was set up to be like an ombudsman to be able to check the effect of how nations are running with the sustainable development goals after the Millennium Development Goals. And it's always a good gathering for all the stakeholders to be able to come together and see how far they have gone.
Now, on the United Nations General Assembly 79, I thought it was quite profound that on the sidelines yesterday, Elon Musk met with a number of world leaders. I believe he met with the Italian Prime Minister, he met with the leader of Argentina, and of course the South African president. Now, we all know, of course, that Elon Musk is of South African descent. What I took away from this is the fact that the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has been on quite a bullish strategy to try and convince Elon Musk Musk to make some heavy investments into South Africa. Why do I bring this up? I think it's quite profound because we started today's program talking about Aliko Dangote and the various challenges that he's having with the massive investment he's made in Nigeria. So you look at one African country that is doing everything possible to lure its own people, whether by descent or by whatever, anybody related to South Africa, who they feel has capacity to invest in that country and build industry in that country that can empower people. They're doing everything possible to court Elon Musk. And then it's so unfortunate that here in Nigeria, we seem to be taking for granted somebody who, I believe in the interview, he said that he pays more tax than the whole banking industry combined. So just wanted to juxtapose those two cases on the sidelines of the ongoing UNGA.
Okay, two things about Egypt providing the second cache of military armory weapons to Somalia. This is the second part. Both countries have a defense pact. But the basic principle in the relationship between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Somalia is this principle that the enemy of my friend is my friend. Okay? And it's on both sides. And so that should be of interest to students of international law, diplomacy, and international relations. Now, the background is simply what you have explained about the conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia, and the conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia. Ethiopia supporting Somaliland that is looking for sovereignty. Ethiopia offending Egypt. Now, what is the background in this regard? Water. Water, we say, is life. We have seen water wars. The water wars research talks about, fight over waters in the Jordan region, where in the California region, even in the United States, because water is life. And in fact, Boutros Ghali, former UN Secretary General, what's his name? Kofi Annan, who was also UN Secretary General, both said the next wars in the Middle East will be fought over water. How did the war occur? They say Egypt is Nile. Nile is Egypt. This fight between Egypt and Ethiopia is over the Blue Nile and the dam that Ethiopia decided to set up in 2011, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It's called the GERD. Now there's an Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1929, which the British signed on behalf of Ethiopia. There is a Nile River Agreement of 1959, which Egypt and Sudan signed. They didn't consult Ethiopia. When Ethiopia now decided to now build a dam at the banks of the Blue Nile, 15 kilometers away from Sudan, Egypt did not like it. And Ethiopia said, no, we are also fighting for our own sovereignty because water security is important. So all the parties involved are fighting for water security. Now, let me cut the story short. The UN intervened, the African Union intervened, the United States intervened. Egypt now said, okay, we will not bomb the Ethiopian dam. And they said, we will look for other options. So supporting the enemy of Ethiopia and their own friend is a way of looking at other options. I guess that's the way it is in international relations. Every country looks out for its own interests. And that's why we keep saying that the most important thing at this United Nations General Assembly 79 is pursuing the cause of peace. As for Israel and Hezbollah, Hezbollah says it's open to war possibilities. Israel says, well, Netanyahu, speaking yesterday, he says the civilians should leave Hezbollah areas because they too are not going to stop. Iran says, in fact, there will be consequences. So they had the deadliest conflict yesterday with the exchange of fire on both sides. The fear is that this escalation of hostilities could possibly lead to a blown-out war in the whole of the Middle East and bring others
Thank
into
you.
it. So these are
thank
the
you very much for your comments.
these are the issues.
I don't know if I've lost your hearing. I hope you can hear me. But thank you very much for your comments there. If you can hear me, we will move on now to newspapers. I hope you can hear me there over in Lagos. I know we're far, far away from each other, but I hope I can be heard. Let's move on to our newspapers. And as ever, we'll start with the front page of This Day newspaper. The front page of This Day today looks at civil society organizations criticizing the elections that took place over the weekend in Edo State, saying that the results have been altered and that they lack transparency. Naturally, the PDP's candidate, Asue Igodalo, has said that the outcome of this election has been, in his words, one of our darkest moments. Meanwhile, the Labour Party also have had quite strong words for the outcome of this election. You do have Peter Obi coming out to say that this election is a mockery of democracy. So still a lot of negative contentions as it pertains to the outcome of the elections in Edo State, which of course delivered the APC's candidate Monday Okpebolo as the winner. Let's move on to The Advocate this morning. The Advocate is a weekly legal focused insert into This Day by Onikepo Braithwaite, and this week she takes a look at making the anti-graft fight real. She speaks a lot about Nigeria under Buhari's presidency and currently now under Tinubu's presidency. But one example she uses is this ongoing spat, this back and forth between former Kogi State Governor Yahaya Bello and his successor, Usman Dodo. So it'll be very interesting. I definitely implore you, with all of these newspapers, to read them, but definitely The Advocate today. Moving on to the New Telegraph now, and they are focusing their front page on flooding and the news that the FPC has set up a committee to reassess the Alao Dam. This is as government advises residents in flood-prone areas to leave as the water level of River Benue has risen to 0.9 meters. Moving on now to The Guardian of Nigeria, and it's taking a look at non-profit businesses in inverted commas, it does report. And its headline says that despite low impacts, more than 174,000 non-government organizations have been established in Nigeria in 4 years. There are 5.1 million registered entities in Nigeria, but only 20% of them pay annual returns, despite the fact that these organizations are able to collect millions of dollars in funding to support a cause. Very interesting there. And then The Punch, it's also featuring quite a heartbreaking story. There was quite a grave car crash at the Lekki toll gate on Monday, which led to the death of 3 people, 3 passengers across 2 different vehicles. Now, one of the drivers of the vehicle has survived the crash up until this point. He is a teenage driver, according to reports, and it is believed that the police will invite him for questioning once he recovers from his own injuries. And then in the Daily Independent, they're featuring a story on Nigeria demanding permanent Security Council seats for African nations. And then if we move on to the Daily Nation of Kenya, they're taking a look at the thousands of jobless Kenyans who are still falling victims to fake recruiters, and it specifically features, you see him on the front page there, a man who's accused of perpetuating a 720 million Kenyan shilling job fraud on a government trip with William Ruto in Germany. So is essentially defrauding Kenyans into believing that there are all of these different international jobs, letting them pay for all of these paperwork, all of this sponsorship, and then there's no job on the back end. It's something that definitely falls victim to Nigerians in the United Kingdom, across the world. Definitely a very interesting story. And then lastly, The Guardian UK talks about Sir Keir Starmer and how he has vowed to end gloom revive as Labour plans to lift spending restrictions and use next month's budget to allow for more spending on housing, roads and hospitals.
Well, thank you very much, Adefemi Akinsanya.